Okay, my name is Peter Badley, and I am the product manager here at Provision Point. Today, we're going to talk about how Provision Point helps improve the governance of Microsoft Teams with a provisioning solution. I wanted to start by just setting the scene, setting the background a little bit to Teams, and then we'll go into the demo and talk about the role Provision Point has and what Provision Point is. So I guess let's talk about the default and some of the challenges around that and the challenges which we see every day as we're talking to customers. Out of the box with Microsoft Teams, everyone can create a team. All users can create a team. There's no justification, there's no approval process. And they're all created the same. They're all created with the same settings turned on, the same setup of the channels, and the associated SharePoint sites. There is really no way to classify them or organize them. They're all flat. And as a result, there's an ever-growing sprawl of teams. Often users complain to us about endless lists of teams within the Teams app, unclear about what the purpose of those teams are, and no lifecycle management or disposal associated with those teams. So that's some of the problems which organizations face around teams and some of those specific governance challenges around teams. So where does Provision Point sit in? Provision Point's an app which you deploy to your Office 365 tenant. It allows you to provision a number of different objects in Office 365. That can be SharePoint sites, modern or classic sites, Office 365 groups, and Microsoft Teams. The aim of our product is to allow people to easily provision and easily create objects in Office 365. It's not to put barriers in the ways of users, but also make life easier for admins. We don't want to transfer lots of responsibility to admin users. We don't want them to have to manage lots of extra processes or do lots of extra things, but we still want to let them have the controls which they want in place over Office 365. So Provision Point sits as that service between users and administrators. We still let users create objects, but we let them create them in a controlled, managed way. And we like to think that there's three things which Provision Point does really well. Firstly, it's about control. We can control who can create which types of teams and have approval before they're created. We let you customize what settings get applied when a new team is created. And we let you classify, capture specific metadata when a team is created, and define lifecycle using leases. And we can see that capability which Provision Point offers by looking at this feature comparison chart. Sure, within the team app, you can do things like create a Microsoft team. Wider in Office 365, you can apply settings to control who can create teams. But that's all you can basically do around governance. Provision Point adds a number of extra layers on top of that, including things like controlling the default team settings, delivering customized creation forms to users with metadata included, approval and auditing associated with creation of teams if you want to, and also components such as retention and archiving of teams. We also have an API available within Provision Point, which helps with bulk creation of teams or more advanced integration scenarios. So I'm going to dive into the demo and I'll walk you through some specific examples. Feel free to ask questions as we go through. I'll come to the questions at the end of the demo if that's okay. I'm going to show you a few different examples and they're going to call out some of the key features in Provision Point around teams and teams governance. So I'm going to show you how to provision a Microsoft team using Provision Point. I'm going to show you how you can have different templates, so it's not a one-size-fits-all approach to teams. I'll show an example of using approval workflows and also when approval workflows aren't used. I'm going to show you a lot of examples around classification of teams. And finally, some examples of lifecycle management and disposal. Okay, let me just drop out of this a second. Okay, so I see a few questions coming in already. Feel free to ask them. I will get to them as we get towards the end of the demo, if that's okay. So I'm logged into Office 365. We can access Provision Point through a few different mechanisms. It's installed within an app within my app launcher here. So you can see Provision Point is an app which I can launch straight from my app launcher. I can access it just straight through the browser. So I can just type a URL and access Provision Point, or I can even access it within Microsoft Teams itself as well. And I'll show you an example of that later on as well. I've already got Provision Point opened here within my browser. So I've got a tab open with Provision Point here. And it's broken down into a number of screens dependent on my role. I'm using a nice shade of blue on Provision Point today. You can use and apply your own color scheme, your own logos as well. Now, as I said, the app's broken down into several different screens. There's a directory tab where I can see a directory of all the different objects which have been created. We're not limited to teams, we're just talking about teams primarily today. So I can see the different objects created, the categorizations, I can filter those. I can look at the objects which I manage within Provision Point. And we'll come back to this area a little bit later on and see some of the other capability in here. I'm going to move across to the Request tab. So the Request tab is where I can request objects in Provision Point. And what I'm able to request is dependent on my permissions. So my permissions, which an administrator has defined for me within Provision Point. Everything's customizable, so the names of these templates can easily be tailored to your specific names, and what get created as part of the request process is entirely customizable to you as well. So let's kick off by just showing a specific example. It's a nice simple example. So I'm going in here and I'm going to request what I've classified as a business area. Now, maybe in my organization, I'm one of a small group of people who are able to create teams. My organization has said, well, actually, we only want a certain number of people who are maybe the power users or champions or whatever they might be to be the users who can request a team. So Teams and SharePoint site creation and group creation is disabled within my organization. So my requests come through the Provision Point app. So I'm going to come here and I'm going to request this new object. So I'm going to give it a name and let's call it marketing. I want to create a team for my marketing team. I can define whether it's public or private, whether I want this private team, not everyone else seeing it. And I can also control its visibility within the Provision Point app. And we'll come back to this area a little bit more as I show you something which is a bit more security defined. In the top right here, your administrator is allowed to define certain request form data for requesting as part of that team. A bit like you put metadata against documents, you can put metadata against teams using Provision Point. And again, this data is specific to you. So in Provision Point, we support the use of various types of fields. So we support text fields, multiple lines of text field if you want sort of a larger description box. We also support drop downs, so a selection of choices, numbers, and also people pickers as well. So maybe you want to define a project manager or a team lead for a specific team you're creating. Because we're creating a modern object, so that could be a team in this case, but also modern SharePoint sites, we're allowed to define the owners and the members of that specific team in this case. Those obviously apply the regular permissions within Teams or SharePoint, but you can also, in Provision Point, there's a bigger concept around owner and various things you can do with a team as the owner within Provision Point. And again, we'll come to that a little bit later. And I'm going to hit request. And it's really as simple as that. I'm just launching a very simple request here to create a new team through the app, and dependent on my permissions, it will let me create that and request that, as we've seen. And that's perhaps the most simple element of using Provision Point, being able to say, well, actually, we want to designate a certain set of users to create this team, and we want to capture certain classification information when they request that team. And we can see that team has been created. There's a number of different ways we can access that team now. We can go into the Info tab, and we can see various bits of information about that team. We've got a link to both the SharePoint site and the Microsoft team. So as well as creating the team, this will also create the group and SharePoint site, which underpins that. So if you want to apply some specific customization to the SharePoint site, you can do that. We're not going to go into great detail about that today, but you can do that. And if you want more information about that, please do contact me during the demo today. And then we also see other information about that team. So we can see things like the request form data, the type of object which has been created, and also who the owners of that specific team are. So we get a lot of information about that team. If we switch over to Teams for a second, we then see that my new marketing team has been created. In this case, it's quite a basic team. There's no specific complex settings against it or anything else like that. And we're going to move on to, in the next couple of demos, just explaining that complexity a little bit more. So that's the first demo I've got for you today, just showing you how Provision Point can be used as part of the provisioning process. Now, I mentioned that Provision Point is also accessible in a number of different mechanisms. If you don't want to use it within the web app itself, you'll see within Teams, I've got an all company team available to me. And I can make the Provision Point app available through Teams as well. So if I want to use Provision Point and the request process within Teams rather than separately within the browser, I can do that as well. I can either view it in this window, or I can easily expand it out so I've got a little bit more room, and I can access my directory, and I can easily go in and request Teams as well. So it gives me a couple of different options about how I can access the app, depending on whether you're maybe solely team-centric around what you're doing, or whether you've got wider requirements around SharePoint and other types of provisioning as well. Okay, let's show another example of a provisioning request, and just upping the complexity a little bit. So I'm going to request a project now. Again, as I said, all these names and terminologies are specific to you and your organization. So let's create a project. Let's give it a name. And just to mention, I'm not sure if anyone's asked that question already, we do have some capability within the product to actually set things like naming conventions for the names of your teams, or even the URLs of the sites which get created as part of the provisioning process as well. And we can use either random, sequential numbering, or even data from your request form. Now, I mentioned request form because you'll notice in this case, I've got different fields of information against my request form. I've got the option to select a department from a list which has been defined for me within the app. So let's say in this case, this is for finance. I can define a project manager. So let's put in Tom. And again, I've got this cost center field, which is shared across multiple different forms. So we've got a lot of flexibility. I'm not going to dwell too much on this form because you've already seen that. Just wanted to point out the fact that we do have different request form data available. And I'm going to hit request. Now you notice in this case, it doesn't start provisioning straight away. And that's because you'll see that it's pending approval. So you can do within Provision Point with any object request. So any of those objects sitting under request have an approval process attached to that. And that approval can either go to a user or to a group of users and can follow multiple steps if you want it to. Now in this case, to make the demo simpler, I've got the approval request coming to myself. Obviously in a real scenario, you would have it going to relevant managers or product owners or even system administrators, however you wanted it to. I will have also received an email in my email box telling me that an approval task has been assigned to me. We can configure notifications in Provision Point to either go on approval tasks, but also on the completion of specific actions. So for example, if the person making the request wants to receive a notification once their team has been created, or even just an administration team wants to be notified that new teams have been requested, but they don't want to do the approval step. In this case, I have got an approval step, so let's go and have a look at this specific task. I'll go in and see the action, and I've got specific details here. I can see who's made the request, and also I can see the request details, including that custom metadata. And then I've got an approval action with the option to apply comments. So I'm going to hit approve here. Now this could go through multiple approval steps, so it might need to go to another person for approval after that first approval step. In this case, it doesn't. It's a very simple request process. So I'm going to navigate back to my directory. You'll see the process is following through to create my team. Now, all of the examples I'm showing you today are quite simple, so they provision quite quickly. When you want to do more advanced things, especially around your SharePoint site, it might take a minute or two to complete those requests, depending on the complexity involved. And you can see that my team has been created. If I switch over to Teams for a second, we can see that that team is now available and created. And also that there is an associated SharePoint site with it as well. Now let's show you some other things and other bits of information which we can deliver and use within Provision Point. So for example, if I look at the further information on this specific team, you'll notice there's also a timeline tab. That shows me a history of all the activity completed within Provision Point against that team. So that could be the creation process, the approval process, but also follow-up actions such as enhancing the SharePoint site, changing owners, or even deletion or archiving. I can see the approval process and go and look at the history of it. So very much like we've got version history of documents, we can also have version history of teams. Finally, against this team, I've also applied something called a lease. And you can see here that after 5 days, a lease action will be applied against that team. Now, unfortunately, we haven't got time to sit here for 5 days and wait for that to expire. So I'll just explain leases briefly. Leases allow you to set certain actions to occur once that time period has been reached. And that could be things like archive, deletion, email notification, or even removing permissions, or a combination of those options. And you can apply leases and different leases to teams, SharePoint sites, and groups within Provision Point. The other thing we can do within Provision Point is manage a directory of objects which have been created using the app. We can see that within the app, but we can also put that into a SharePoint list as well, if you maybe want to use it on one of your intranet portals or something else like that. And if you have a look here, you can see I've got that directory list available to me with that custom metadata such as the cost center, who the owner is, and the type of object. And I could use that however I want to do it to visualize that. And here is actually a link. Each of these links here links off to the individual team. This information is also available within the team app if you want it to as well. So if I go to Teams and look at the directory tab I've created, that same directory is available here as well. So I can access that information directly from within Teams as well. It gives me lots of options for being able to navigate, find information, understand my teams in a much more valuable context than just as a listing within the Teams app. Okay, we've just about got time for one more demo. So let's go in and request our final object today, which I've called an executive workspace. So let's say we want to design some new corporate policies. Now, a few things you'll notice straight away. This object is marked as private, so we can define that certain teams and sites get automatically created as private, so not visible to the rest of the organization. We can also set its visibility within the directory, so it's only visible to owners in the Provision Point app. So excluding it and hiding it away so people aren't seeing it and questioning what this might be and discovering it within Office 365. You'll also have noticed that there was no extra request form data as part of that request. So a very focused, specific object, which might only be available to very specific users within my organization to request. So although I've been able to request all those 3 teams, maybe other users in my organization wouldn't be able to request that executive workspace, for example, because it's private and secure, and we're going to limit it to maybe only a couple of people to be able to request, and it's private, and people know what its purpose is. The other thing which we're doing as part of creation of this team is we're applying certain settings against this team. While this is completing, I'll show you what I mean. If I have a look at my previous team I created, so this specific project, you'll notice that it's just using a number of default settings, all of which are enabled. This is very much similar to the settings within Teams natively. Now let's look at my new team I've created. And if we have a look at the settings for that, you'll notice that a number of those options are unticked. So for this type of team being created, we can define certain default settings, maybe making it more secure and making it more private. And this is just a flavor of some of the customization options which Provision Point allows you to do against a team, defaulting certain settings and options specific to your organizational need and controlling who can create those specific objects. Okay. That wraps up the demo. Hopefully it gave you an idea of what Provision Point is capable of in terms of controlling which users can request certain teams, managing approval processes, classifying those objects, and also adding options like lifecycle management to enhance the governance story. I'm going to leave my contact details up on the screen so you've got them. Feel free to reach out if you'd like further information. I'll now take the opportunity to go through some of the questions which we've had today. Okay, so quite a few questions. We'll kick off with this question. Does your solution only work with Teams or also with Yammer? What will be provisioned next to the Teams environment? Modern SharePoint sites, Planner, Stream. Okay, yeah. So we support the provisioning of all sorts of objects in Office 365. You've mentioned most of those in that question there. When provisioning a team, we do create an Office 365 group and a modern SharePoint site. That will also include a planner plan. We do have some options around provisioning a Yammer group as well if you want to. We also, if you don't want to create a team, we have a separate option to provision a modern team site and group, or a modern site without a group, or even we've got some customers who are still using classic options as well. So we also support using classic team sites, classic site collections, even subsites if you want to. Okay. Okay, this is quite an interesting one. Does your solution allow to select a specific SMTP domain to be used for your teams if you want to? Yes, so that's not something as default which we are able to do, but we do have a customer who's doing that. So we have an extensions module as part of the app. So where there's specific scenarios like that, we would be able to support those. It's probably best if I take that specific question offline so I can answer that in more detail. Okay, next question's about pricing. Yes, so the simplest starting point around pricing is actually to have a look at our website. So if you go to provisionpoint.com, there's a link at the top there for pricing. We have different pricing bands dependent on your number of users. So have a look at those. And if you've got any further questions around pricing, feel free to contact me using those details which I've shared. Okay, next one's about approvals. How does the approval work, and is there options for sort of hierarchical approval dependent on users or conditional approval? So in Provision Point, the native approval is quite parallel approval, so linear approval. So one user will approve it, then the next user or group will approve it, and those are set groups or users. So if you want to say Peter approves it and then Tom's approves it. If you've got specific approval scenarios where you need logic or dynamic rules as part of that approval, then you can do that, but you would use a third-party workflow solution. So that could use Flow, Nintex K2, or one of the other workflow solutions as well. So yeah, you can certainly do that sort of thing if you want to. Any further questions? I think I see one more question come through. Oh no, that's another question about the cost. So yeah, just a reminder that you can access the cost information on the Provision Point website. And oh yeah, one more question here is about trials. So yes, we do offer a trial of Provision Point. So if you would like to sign up for a trial, please contact us. So either contact me or reply to the follow-up email, which will be sent out after this demo, and we can go through with you and set up a 30-day trial of Provision Point. It's a fully functional trial, so if you want to provision teams or provision other types of objects, then you can do that as well as part of signing up for the trial, and we'll actually show you and walk you through setting up the app as well. Oh yeah, and finally, someone's just asked actually about recording, but I was about to say that. So this webinar has been recorded. So a follow-up email will be sent after the webinar, asking for if you need any more help or information, and we'll also share a link to the recording. We also, if you check out our website or our Twitter feed, We have various videos which are pre-recorded, little snapshot videos. So if you just want to see a short bit or share a short bit, you can do. And also we will share the full webinar details as well. Finally, also do check out our blog. We blog regularly, share insights, not just about Teams and Teams provisioning, but also the other things we do like SharePoint provisioning and Office 365 group provisioning as well. I'm going to be online for the next minute or two, so feel free to ask me any more questions, or like I say, feel free to contact me using the details which I've shared. Otherwise, thank you very much for attending the webinar.